They expected me to cry. I could feel it in the way the front benches left space around me, the way the women on either side angled their shoulders inward, as if bracing for something to shatter. A healer learns to read a room the way she reads a pulse, and the choosing hall that morning had the quiet of people waiting to witness a wound. Alpha Brenner Holt stood on the dais in his ceremonial gray, the binding roll unrolled in his hands, and when his eyes passed over Mira Vale, my name, read aloud only in my own head the way I'd been bracing for it all morning, and moved on, I made myself breathe slowly, the way I taught frightened patients to breathe before a needle. He said, "Lady Celine Arwick, not my name. Hers." Celine rose from the second row with the composed grace of a woman who had expected this outcome for weeks, and the hall erupted into the polite, rustling applause court gatherings, save for moments that matter more than they're allowed to admit. Somewhere near the front, in a seat close enough to the dais that I noticed her even then, Lady Vesper Dane watched the empty Luna's chair rather than the newly announced couple, the way a woman watches a door she still expects to walk through one day. I smiled. It wasn't the brave smile people give when they're determined not to break in public. I know that smile. I've worn it at deathbeds and watched patients wear it while I set their bones. This was different. This was relief moving through my chest, like warmth, returning to a numbed limb, sudden and almost painful in its intensity. I hadn't realized how long I'd been holding my breath until I let it go. The court wasn't watching me, of course. Every eye in that hall was fixed on Brenner and Celine, on the political arithmetic of a new alliance being sealed in real time. Every eye except one. King Cassian Rourke sat on the dais above the proceedings, and when I glanced up, I found him already looking at me. Not at the newly chosen couple, not at the roll, not at the hall. At me, at my smile. He went very still. I know stillness. I've held my hand flat against a wolf's chest to measure the seconds between heartbeats, and I recognized what I was seeing in him as the same kind of stillness. A man doing careful, silent math on information he hadn't expected to need. I didn't understand why yet. I only knew that his eyes stayed on me a beat too long for a king who had no reason to care whether a healer's assistant smiled or wept at another woman's binding. I looked away first. That felt safer. Beside his throne, empty as it had been for the whole of my life, in Ironhold Keep, sat the Luna's chair. Black oak, carved with old runes I'd never learned to read. Polished by servants who dusted it every week and sat in it never. 9 years the king had ruled, and 9 years that chair had stayed empty, and the court had built a mythology around the emptiness. A broken heart, a political calculation, a promise made to someone who never arrived. I would learn much later, from Cassian himself, that the truth was simpler. He had refused every political Luna arrangement his council proposed, one after another, because he would not fill the chair with an alliance and call it a marriage. The chair had been empty on principle long before it had anything to do with me. I never once imagined it had anything to do with me. Why would I? I was the third healer in Ironhold Keep, competent with dosages and steady with a suturing needle, but I had no noble blood, no family name worth mentioning at court, nothing that would ever put me within reach of a throne. My name had ended up on the binding roll because my home pack owed grain to the crown's vassal system, and Alpha Brenner had found a use for that debt that had nothing to do with grain at all. He'd claimed I hadn't completed my formal healer's rank, technically true and entirely beside the point, since the exemption existed for working healers, regardless of rank precisely, to stop men like him from using an unfinished certificate as leverage. He used my pack's debt the way a man uses a lever. If he had chosen me that morning, refusal would not have simply been mine to give. My pack would have paid for it in grain quotas and worse. So when he said Celine's name instead, I smiled, and it had nothing to do with kings or thrones or empty chairs. It had everything to do with going home to my own small room that night instead of Brenner Holt's. What I didn't know yet, sitting there in that crowded hall with my sleeve pulled carefully down over my left wrist, was that I already had a reason he hadn't chosen me, and that the reason was cool silver against my pulse. and that the king, currently watching me with an expression I couldn't read, had put it there himself. The mark had appeared 4 months earlier, on an ordinary morning that gave no warning it would become the axis my whole life turned on. I woke to find a thin crescent etched into the skin on the inside of my left wrist, silver and faintly luminous in the gray dawn light, cool to the touch the way metal is cool. I sat up in bed and stared at it for a long time before I let myself think the word claim. I'd studied enough healers' texts on wolf bonding to recognize a protective mark when I saw one, even one this deliberately faint. It wasn't a completed mate mark. Those ran deeper, warmer, tied to blood and voice and years. This was something else, designed to be legally sufficient and emotionally restrained, meant to block a claim rather than announce one. Only a royal wolf could make something like it. I knew that much from training. What I didn't know was why mine. I told no one. Not Adra, who had trained me and would have recognized it in half a second. Not my mother, 3 days ride away and already burdened enough. I understood, with the practicality that had gotten me through healer's training in the first place, exactly what would happen if I did. The court would call me ambitious. If the king learned I knew and said nothing, he might feel obligated to claim me publicly to settle the ambiguity, and I would become a political fact before I'd had a chance to become a person with an opinion about any of it. And beneath all of that, quieter. I wasn't certain what I wanted the mark to mean. Better to keep my sleeve down until I understood my own reaction to it. At the choosing ceremony, I later learned, Brenner's wolf had caught the royal claim the instant he stood near me and simply refused to select. He likely never knew why. He only knew his wolf wouldn't move forward, and so he chose the willing, capable woman standing 2 rows behind me instead, and Celine Arwick walked toward her future with her eyes open, and her ambitions entirely her own. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy and unfair to paint her as a rival, in a story that was never about her at all. She wanted the alliance. She got it. Good for her. I got to keep my life for 1 more day without understanding why. 2 days later, Beta Oren Hale found me in the infirmary corridor with the posture of a man delivering a message he didn't fully believe in himself. Healer Mira, he said, the king requests your presence in the royal library. There's a water-damaged manuscript, medical text. He'd like your assessment. I looked at him for a long moment. Oren is not a good liar, which I mean as a compliment to his character. The royal library is the driest room in the entire keep. Nothing in that room had ever been water-damaged in living memory. Of course, I said, and watched Oren's shoulders drop in relief that I hadn't made him defend the lie further. I went anyway. I told myself it was professional curiosity. I did not examine that explanation too closely. The library smelled of beeswax and pine smoke and old dry paper, amber light slanting through the high windows onto shelves that ran floor to ceiling. Cassian stood at the far window. Deliberately far, I would come to understand. The width of the room held between us like a boundary he'd measured on purpose. On the reading table sat a medical manuscript, entirely undamaged, its binding tight and its pages crisp. I didn't waste time on pretense. I pulled back my sleeve and held out my wrist, the crescent catching the amber light. You put this here. It wasn't a question, but he answered it as one anyway. Yes. When? The night I learned your name was on the binding roll. Why? Because Brenner's claim would have taken effect within the week, and a formal royal intervention would have exposed exactly what I didn't want exposed, that I had a reason to care who touched your name on that roll. His men were already watching every candidate's quarters, reporting anything unusual back to him. A private summons to you, days before the ceremony, would have told him exactly what he needed to know, and he'd have moved the date up rather than let me interfere. The mark stopped his wolf without announcing anything to the court, or to him, or to you. I'm not telling you that to excuse it. You asked why, and that's the honest answer, not a good one. What rights does it give you? He didn't flinch from the question, which I noted and filed away as meaningful. None that I've exercised. It blocks other claims. It doesn't create one of its own unless you allow it to deepen over time. How did you put it there? I never woke. A sealed blood oath, cast at distance. It doesn't require touch, only intent, and a drop of my own blood on the roll where your name was written. It can't compel affection, obedience, or proximity. It isn't built to reach that far into a person. It can only stand between you and a claim that isn't freely given. And it doesn't last. 6 months, unless you renew it yourself, knowingly. After that, it simply fades. Can it be removed sooner? Yes. There's a process. I can walk you through it today if you want it gone by tonight. Why didn't you ask me first? That was the question that mattered, and I watched him take his time with it instead of reaching for something easy. Because I chose the fastest way to stop them, he said finally. That does not make the absence of your permission disappear. I know that. I knew it that night too, and I did it anyway, because I told myself speed mattered more than asking. I'm not going to pretend that reasoning survives daylight. I appreciated that he didn't try to make it survive daylight. I've treated enough patients who'd rather argue with a diagnosis than accept it to recognize the relief of a man who simply lets the truth sit where it lands. How long did you intend to stay silent about it? I don't know, he admitted. I told myself I'd decide once the danger to you had passed. I understand now that isn't an answer. It's a delay dressed up as one. I studied him the way I studied a patient presenting symptoms that didn't quite match the story they were telling. His hands were folded behind his back, knuckles pale with the effort of stillness. I expected you to be furious, he said quietly, or afraid. I've turned that hall over in my mind for 2 days trying to understand why you smiled instead. I was free of him, I said. I hadn't worked out yet whether I was free with you. Something in his expression shifted at that. Not hurt exactly, more like a man recalibrating a measurement he'd made too quickly. That's fair, he said. I still don't have an answer, I told him. I'm not refusing you, and I'm not accepting anything. I don't know yet, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make this easier for either of us. I'm not asking you to know, he said. I'm asking what would help you find out, or decide you don't want to. That, more than the confession, was the moment the whole shape of things changed for me. Not because it was romantic, because it was the first time in the entire ordeal that anyone had asked me what I wanted instead of deciding for me and calling it protection. He laid out the terms plainly, the way I imagine he laid out treaties. I could choose an independent healer with no loyalty to the crown to remove the mark privately, with no political consequence owed to anyone. I would keep my position in the infirmary regardless. He would arrange legal protection so my name could never again appear on a binding roll, mark or no mark. I could refuse all courtship, could leave Ironhold if I wanted, and the Luna's chair would stay exactly what it had been for 9 years, empty and no longer my concern. He would bear whatever cost the removal ritual required. That detail, offered without emphasis, told me more than the rest of the speech combined. I didn't remove it that day. I didn't accept it either. I asked for time, and he gave it without a single condition attached, which was, I would come to understand, entirely in character for a man who had just spent an hour proving he'd finally learned the difference between protecting someone and deciding for them. What followed over the next several weeks was not courtship in any form I recognized from the stories healers trade during long night shifts to stay awake. It was books. Oren delivered the first one 3 days after the library conversation, looking faintly embarrassed as he set it on my infirmary counter. A treatise on willow bark dosage for fever management, with a single folded note tucked inside the cover. The bark you use is prepared at standard concentration. Have you found cases where a reduced dose performs better in elderly patients? I'd value an honest answer, written or otherwise. No obligation to reply. I answered it. It was a legitimate clinical question, and I had strong opinions about it. Developed over 3 years of watching Idra adjust dosages by instinct, I was slowly learning to translate into written protocol. Another book came the following week. Then, another, Herbal Interactions. Wolf healing after silver exposure, infection management in field conditions. Each one carried a real question, specific enough that I understood. These weren't invented excuses to get a note into my hands. He genuinely wanted to know what I thought. I told him once, halfway through the 5th book, that he could simply summon me if he wanted to talk. A summons can't be refused, he said. Not safely. Not by someone in your position. A question about Willowbark can be. I wanted every conversation between us to be one you were free to decline. I hadn't declined a single one, but I understood, sharply, why the option mattered to him more than the outcome. The first time I let 6 days pass without answering, buried under a fever outbreak in the lower ward, no second book came to press me. No summons followed to ask why. Oren mentioned only that the king assumed I was busy and hoped the ward was recovering. That silence told me more than any letter could have. The distance in the library shrank gradually, the way a wound closes, not all at once, but steadily. I began correcting his medical texts in the margins instead of separate notes. He began telling me things that had nothing to do with Willowbark, that he hadn't slept a full night in longer than he could remember, that the insomnia had started before the mark, before me, back when 9 years of rule had first settled into something permanent in his shoulders. I noticed the way he gripped the back of chairs when he was restraining something he wanted to say, and hadn't yet decided whether to. I didn't say anything about it. I just kept coming back. First, because the questions interested me, and then, somewhere in the 4th week, because I wanted to see him ask the next one. One evening, he reached toward my healer's satchel on the reading table, some instinct toward a strap, and stopped himself half a hand's width from touching it. I understood all at once that he had decided, every single time, not to close any distance between us, unless I closed it first. I did not close it. Not yet. But I noticed, and noticing was its own kind of answer forming, slowly. Lady Vesper Dane came to the infirmary on an ordinary afternoon, complaining of headaches that presented with none of the physical markers headaches actually leave. I treated her anyway, and noted her eyes kept finding my left cuff throughout the consultation. "You must be exhausted," she said, in the tone of someone building toward a point. "Carrying something like that, a mark placed without your say-so, and everyone at court whispering about what it means." "I manage," I said. "There are tinctures," she said, with the careful lightness of an offer she'd rehearsed, "that can lift an unwanted claim cleanly. No pain, no political mess. I only mention it because I'd hate to see you trapped by something you never agreed to in the first place." I understood the offer for what it was long before she finished making it. Not concern, reconnaissance. "The mark was placed without my consent," I told her, meeting her eyes directly. "Keeping it now is my decision." It was the first time I'd said it plainly, even to myself. I watched something shift behind Vesper's composed expression. A woman recalculating a plan that had just lost one of its variables. House Dane had sat on the Regency Council for 3 generations, and court gossip had all but promised Vesper the Luna's chair as a formality, waiting on the king's schedule rather than his choice. The binding reform whispers already moving through the keep threatened the entire patronage system her family depended on, and a chair filled by a rival with no bloodline and no debt to House Dane threatened it further still. She left without pressing further, and I understood, with the clarity healers developed for reading danger in a patient's silence, that persuasion had failed, and something else would follow it. It followed 8 days later, in the form of a new shipment of willow bark powder marked for the king's evening tonic. I caught it because I catch things, professionally, out of habit built over years of checking every batch that entered the infirmary stores before it touched a patient. The smell was wrong first, a faint, bitter almond note beneath the usual dry, papery scent of properly cured bark. The texture was wrong next, slightly too fine, milled differently than our regular supplier ever milled it. The seal on the crate didn't match our standard supplier's mark, and there was no witness signature on the delivery ledger, which our protocol required for every single shipment without exception. Black heartseed produces that bitter almond smell when ground fine enough to disguise itself in bark powder. At a lethal dose, it stops a heart outright, but the amount hidden in that shipment was measured too carefully for that. enough instead to interfere with a wolf's ability to shift cleanly, leaving a king unable to command his own change in front of his court, weak in a way that would look, to anyone not looking closely, like an unexplained decline, not a murder, a slow, public case for why the throne needed a steadier hand behind it. I sealed the contaminated batch immediately and kept a clean control sample separate from it, the way Edra had drilled into me my first year of training. I checked the storage ledger against the delivery gap and found 4 days unaccounted for. I questioned the courier and traced a silver payment back through him to a household guard I recognized from Vesper Dane's retinue. I brought Edra in as an independent witness before I said a word to anyone with power to act on it. I sent Orin a private warning to secure the king's cup without explaining why. I had a second physician outside my own household confirm the poison test before I let myself trust my own eyes. Every step, I built the way I'd build a case file for a coroner's inquiry, because an accusation against a noblewoman would need to survive scrutiny far harsher than anything I'd face myself. I walked into the great hall during the evening meal, without waiting for an invitation, still in my stained healer's apron because there hadn't been time to change, and because I wanted the apron scene. I set the sealed poison jar on the table beside Cassian's untouched cup. "Do not drink anything prepared from the new willow batch," I said, and the hall went silent, the way a room goes silent when it senses something real is about to happen, instead of something ceremonial. I laid it out in order, the way I'd present a diagnosis to a room of skeptical healers. The bitter almond scent that didn't belong in cured bark, the mismatched supplier seal, the missing witness signature, the poison test confirmed independently, the courier, and the silver payment traced through him. The household guard the payment led back to. Vesper laughed, a bright, brittle sound meant to fill the silence. This is remarkable theater from a healer's assistant who's decided she's more important than her station allows. Importance is a court question, I said. Poison is a medical one. I don't need the first to answer the second. Cassian did not speak over me. It would have been easy for him to end the confrontation in a single sentence backed by the full weight of his throne, and he chose not to. He let the courier's testimony stand on its own. He ordered the independent physician to confirm the findings aloud, rather than take my word alone. He had the payment record read into the court ledger. It was Edra who asked the question that broke the room open, not Cassian. "I only told the king's steward it was a shipment," she said, watching Vesper with the flat, patient attention she'd once used to catch me making a dosage error in my first year of training. I never said which one, and neither did Mira, not to anyone outside this hall. "How did you know it was the willow bark?" She answered before she caught herself, and the answer told the room everything her composure had spent the whole confrontation trying to hide. The guard broke shortly after, confessing under questioning that Vesper had planned to dose the king's tonic gradually over weeks, staging a visible decline that would raise doubts about his fitness to rule while she pointed the court toward my secret mark as proof of a healer's ambition gone too far, clearing the way for a regency sympathetic to House Dane's interests once the doubt had done its work. It was my investigation that ended it, not the mark, not Cassian's authority. A sealed jar, a ledger, a traced payment, and the plain habit of checking a batch before it touched a patient. Vesper was arrested that same night and formally tried for conspiracy against the crown, medical tampering, bribery, and attempted incapacitation of a reigning alpha king. Her family's finances came under separate investigation once the payment trail widened. The courier, having cooperated fully and acted under duress, received a reduced sentence rather than the full weight of the law. Nothing about the process was fast or theatrical. It took the ordinary grinding shape of real justice. Weeks, hearings, and paperwork no ballad would ever mention. He had asked me privately first, 2 nights after the trial concluded, standing at that same careful distance in the library he'd never quite closed without permission. I was the one who chose to answer where the court could hear it, because I wanted the terms on record where no one could later pretend they hadn't been spoken aloud. Once the danger had passed, and the last of the evidence had been formally entered into record, Cassian stood before the full court and walked to the Luna's chair. He pulled it out from the table himself, not a servant, not a ceremony, just a king dragging a heavy black oak chair a few inches across polished stone so the space behind it opened wide enough for a person to sit. "You may sit if you choose," he said, loud enough for the hall to hear, but speaking, I understood, only to me. "You may walk away and remain protected if you do not. Either answer stands." I understood what sitting would mean, and I made certain the whole hall understood it the same way I did, publicly accepting courtship, acknowledging a bond that might, in time, become permanent if it became anything at all, beginning, slowly, whatever training a future Luna might someday require, with no promise attached to the word future. I understood just as clearly what it wouldn't mean. Not marriage, not that night or any night soon. Not a completed mating bond forced into existence by ceremony. Not the title of Luna itself, which I would not carry until I had earned and chosen it separately. Not the end of my healer's work, or the surrender of my right to walk back out of that hall whenever I chose to. Before I moved, I asked him 3 questions in front of the entire court, because I had learned, across every conversation in that library, that the terms mattered more than the gesture. Will I keep my place in the infirmary? Yes. Will the binding rolls be reviewed? Yes. Starting with yours, and every name like it. Will the mark stay removable until I choose, freely, to let it become something permanent? For as long as you need, he said. That was never in question. I walked across the hall on my own legs, at my own pace, and the mark on my wrist warmed as I moved, but never once pulled me forward. Never made the decision for me the way it so easily could have, if he'd built it differently. I sat down in the Luna's chair, and for the first time in 9 years, Ironhold Keep had one that wasn't empty. The reform took longer than the trial had, which surprised no one who understood court politics. I spent months arguing the binding law changes before vassal representatives who had built their authority on the old system and had no interest in dismantling it, simply because a healer had survived it. We won the changes in pieces, not all at once. No person could be exchanged against pact debt, and no family could be punished for a candidate's refusal. No binding could proceed without documented, explicit consent, independent legal counsel, and a healer's vocational exemption that completed rank could no longer strip away. Any protective mark placed for safety had to expire automatically within a fixed term, unless knowingly renewed, remain independently removable at any time, and could never on its own create marriage rights. The audit that followed found my own village's grain debt, inflated years past what it should have been, padded quietly by Brenner to keep leverage over families like mine, long after the original shortfall had been repaid. The quota was corrected, my mother received credit against next year's harvest, and Brenner lost authority to place any debtor's name on a binding roll at all. A power stripped from every vassal alpha in that same session. I didn't feel triumphant hearing it. Mostly I felt tired. The way you feel when a wound finally closes after you'd stopped expecting it to. Cassian supported every one of those changes, but he never once tried to pass them by decree alone. And I noticed that, and it mattered to me, more than any declaration he could have made in that hall. Formal courtship continued the way it had begun. Slowly, on my terms, with him learning, gradually and sometimes clumsily, to ask for what he wanted directly instead of hiding it inside a question about willow bark. I kept healing. I sat in on council sessions and said what I thought. The crescent on my wrist warmed further, month over month, shifting from cold silver toward warm pearl, not because the magic decided anything on its own, but because I did, slowly, and it simply reflected a choice that was mine the whole way through. The first kiss happened in the library, months after the trial, months after the first reform vote passed, long after I'd stopped needing anyone's permission to want what I wanted. "May I close the distance?" he asked, standing exactly as far from me as he always had. "Yes," I said. He crossed the space he'd spent all those months carefully preserving, and when he kissed me, It felt like the ending of a much longer conversation than either of us had ever spoken aloud. A year later, I sat my formal healer's examination under Edra's direct supervision. The same exemption Brenner once tried to twist against me, now protected by law for every healer after me. I passed on the strength of my own casework, and Edra signed my license herself before taking a seat on the Binding Law Commission as its independent healer representative. I am Luna, Consort of Ironvale now, a licensed royal healer in my own right, and chair of the commission that grew out of the reforms we fought for that first winter. I've trained 4 new healers since the chair stopped being empty, and I treat highborn patients and lowborn ones under exactly the same standard, because that was always the point, long before any of this had a crown attached to it. On an ordinary evening in the Great Hall, no ceremony, no court watching, I sit in the Luna's chair reviewing a report on a new willow bark supplier, while Cassian argues with Orin across the table about a grain levy neither of them will admit they actually agree on. I feel him watching me before I look up. "You're doing it again," I say. "Doing what?" Looking at me like the chair might be empty again when you look back. He doesn't deny it. "I'm still surprised, some days, that you chose to sit in it at all." I reach across the table and take his hand, and the crescent on my wrist is warm against his skin. Warm the whole way through, the way it only ever became once I decided, on my own, that it should. The mark had freed me from Brenner, but it had never made me his. It only became something worth keeping after he told me the truth about it, after he handed me the power to remove it whenever I chose, after he learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to ask instead of decide. The Luna's chair was never a throne I won by being claimed. It was a question left open for 9 years, until I was finally free enough to answer it myself. Was Cassian right to save Mira with a mark she never consented to? Or did the good outcome still fail to justify the choice he made without asking her first? Tell us what you think in the comments.